This photograph sat forgotten for over 150 years. When a museum finally restored it, what they found inside it changed everything. In March 2020, a badly damaged photograph arrived at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., part of a larger collection donated by the descendants of a Freedmen's Bureau worker. Senior conservator Michael Chen carefully lifted it from its protective sleeve. Severe water damage ran along the edges. Fading obscured most of the detail. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written a single line. Family. Charleston, South Carolina. 1866. Even through the damage, Michael could make out three figures. A black woman, seated in the center. A black man standing beside her, one hand resting on her shoulder. And in her arms, wrapped in white cloth and lace, an infant, held close against her chest. Michael had restored hundreds of Civil War and Reconstruction-era photographs across his 15-year career. But something about this one held his attention. 1866 mattered. It was just 1 year after the war ended, the earliest days of Reconstruction, when 4 million formerly enslaved people were living their first year of legal freedom in a South that remained hostile and often dangerous. He placed the photograph under the digital microscope and began the slow work of high-resolution scanning. The museum's newest restoration technology could recover detail invisible to the naked eye, cutting through decades of damage, aging, and chemical decay to reveal what lay beneath. As the first scan resolved on his monitor, the couple's faces sharpened. The woman looked to be in her mid-20s, her features dignified, her eyes carrying something between strength and sorrow. The man appeared slightly older, maybe 30, his expression serious, protective. Both wore simple, carefully kept clothing, the kind a newly freed family might have saved for months to afford. It was the bundle in her arms that made him pause. As the software kept processing, sharpening contrast, pulling detail out of the fading, something unexpected surfaced. The white cloth around the infant wasn't just a wrap. It had been arranged, deliberately, to cover most of the baby's face, leaving only a small portion visible. Michael adjusted the settings, narrowing in on that one section. He raised the resolution, filtered out the water damage, corrected for the chemical fading. Then, he saw it. Or rather, he saw something that didn't make sense. The visible patch of the infant's skin was distinctly lighter than either parent holding him. Significantly lighter. He sat back, running through explanations, photographic anomalies, uneven chemical fading, quirks of the aging process. But he'd handled thousands of deteriorated photographs, and this didn't match any pattern of decay he knew. He saved the file and picked up the phone. "Sarah," he said when she answered, "I need you to come look at something. And I need you to tell me I'm not seeing what I think I'm seeing." Dr. Sarah Mitchell arrived within the hour, reading glasses pushed up into her hair, a worn leather notebook under her arm. At 58, she'd spent 3 decades studying the private lives of black families during and after slavery, the realities the official record so often failed to capture. Michael said nothing. He just turned the monitor toward her and watched her face. Sarah studied the image for a long moment, her expression shifting from curiosity to something sharper. She leaned in, taking in the couple first, then letting her eyes drop to the infant. "Zoom in on the baby," she said quietly. Michael enlarged the visible portion of the infant's face. At higher resolution, the contrast was unmistakable, skin distinctly lighter, features suggesting European ancestry. Sarah didn't speak for almost a minute. Then she pulled up a chair, sat down, and didn't take her eyes off the screen. 1866, she said. Charleston, 1 year after the war. She chose her next words carefully. "Michael, do you know what Charleston was like in 1866? I know it was the heart of the Confederacy, one of the last cities to fall. It was more than that. It was home to some of the wealthiest plantation families in the South. When the war ended, those plantations didn't vanish. The land stayed, the former owners stayed, and 4 million people who'd been enslaved were suddenly free with nowhere to go, no resources, and no protection under the law. She opened her notebook and began writing as she spoke. During slavery, historians estimate hundreds of thousands of children were born from situations where enslaved women had no choice, no voice, no protection from the men who claimed to own them. After emancipation, those children didn't disappear. Those families didn't stop existing. They had to figure out how to raise a child born of violence, in a country that refused to admit the violence had happened at all. Michael felt something heavy settle in his chest. You're saying this, baby? I'm saying this photograph may document something most records from this era deliberately erased. A black family, newly free, raising a child whose face told a truth everyone knew and no one would say out loud. She stood and moved closer to the screen again, studying the woman's posture, the set of her arms. Look at how she's holding him. That's not shame. That's protection. That's love. She pointed to the man's hand on her shoulder. And that's solidarity. She turned to Michael. We need to find out who these people were. Not to sensationalize this. To understand it. Because this photograph represents thousands of families who lived through exactly this, and whose stories were never written down. Where do we start? Freedmen's Bureau records. Church registries. Birth records. If they exist. And we go carefully, Michael. This isn't a curiosity. This is someone's family. There may be descendants alive today who don't know any of this. She picked up her phone. I'm calling Dr. Robert Hayes at the College of Charleston. If anyone has a way into these records, it's him. Dr. Robert Hayes drove up from Charleston 3 days later with 2 boxes of photocopied Freedmen's Bureau records, church registries, and personal papers gathered over 20 years of research. A tall man in his 60s with silver hair and a careful manner. He spread the documents across the research table. 1866, Charleston, he began, pulling out a ledger. The Bureau was overwhelmed trying to register thousands of formerly enslaved people, record marriages that had never been legal, document births, open schools. The records are incomplete, sometimes contradictory. But they're what we have. He opened to a marked page. I looked for families registered in Charleston in 1866 with anything unusual noted. The Bureau agents were mostly northern whites who didn't always understand or want to acknowledge what they were seeing. But sometimes they left clues, hesitations, marginal notes. He tapped an entry dated July 1866, Thomas and Catherine, married by Bureau authority, June 1866. 1 child, infant, age not recorded. Look at this notation in the margin. Faint pencil marks read, special circumstances. The phrase crossed out. That phrase appears in only a handful of these records. Usually when a registrar ran into something they didn't know how to write down officially. Michael photographed the page. Is there an address? Hayes unfolded a hand-drawn 1866 map of Charleston. Based on cross-referencing several records, I believe they lived in Hampstead, north of the city center, one of several settlements where newly freed people tried to build independent communities. The land was poor, resources were scarce, but it was theirs. He pulled out one more document, a letter from a Freedmen's Bureau teacher, Elizabeth Warren, to her family in Massachusetts, dated August 1866. Sarah read it aloud. The situations I encounter here challenge everything I was raised to believe about propriety. Today I met a young couple, Thomas and Catherine, who have taken in an infant whose very existence testifies to the cruelties these people endured. Yet Thomas speaks of the child with such tenderness, calling him our son without hesitation. Catherine holds him as fiercely as any mother I have ever seen. They asked me to teach them to read, so they might one day write their family's story for the boy. I was moved to tears by their dignity in circumstances no family should have to face. The room went quiet. Sarah set the letter down carefully, her hands not quite steady. This has to be them. The timing matches. The location matches. And the description matches exactly what we see in the photograph. Hayes nodded. There's more. A registry from St. Stephen's African Methodist Episcopal Church, founded that same year, lists a baptism in September 1866. Child of Thomas and Catherine, name recorded as Samuel. The reverend who performed it, Elijah Martin, had himself been enslaved before becoming a minister. Samuel, Michael said softly, looking at the infant on the screen. He had a name. With Thomas, Catherine, and Samuel identified, the team turned to their individual histories. Hayes spent 2 weeks back in Charleston, piecing Catherine's story together from plantation ledgers, sale records, and bureau testimonies, fragments from a system designed to reduce people to property. She had been born around 1841 on Whitfield Plantation, 20 miles inland. The plantation records listed her only as Catherine. Housemaid, no surname, no parents, no history. But Hayes found a line in the owner's personal correspondence from 1858, referencing the housemaid, Catherine, who serves in the main residence, working inside the house rather than in the fields. Put her in constant proximity to the family that claimed to own her, a proximity that, for enslaved women, often meant more danger, not less. No protection, no escape. Jonathan Whitfield, the plantation's owner, died in 1864 during the war's final year. His property, including the people he'd enslaved, was divided among creditors and distant relatives. What happened to Catherine immediately afterward isn't recorded, but she surfaces in Charleston's bureau records by June 1866, which suggests she left the plantation the moment news of emancipation reached her. Sarah found Catherine's own testimony, given to a bureau worker in July 1866, and recorded in clipped official shorthand, came to Charleston seeking work. Infant, born, March 1866. Wishes to marry Thomas, a freedman from Colton County. Requests legal recognition of marriage. The dates told a hard story. If Samuel was born in March 1866, he'd been conceived around June 1865, weeks after the war ended, while Catherine was likely still on or near Whitfield Plantation, with nowhere else to go. She was free, Sarah explained to the team. Legally, on paper, she was free. But freedom without resources, without protection, without any system of justice that recognized crimes against black women, that wasn't freedom at all. She was still exposed to the men who'd once claimed ownership over her. Thomas's story was easier to trace. He'd been enslaved on a smaller plantation in Colton County. After emancipation, he worked the Charleston docks, saving what he could and looking for a way to build something of his own. How he and Catherine met isn't recorded, but by June 1866, they had chosen to marry and raise Samuel together. Hayes found one more document, a November 1866 property record showing Thomas had purchased a quarter-acre plot in Hampstead with a small dwelling. For $12, an enormous sum for a man 6 months removed from slavery. He bought land, Michael said, something like awe in his voice. Half a year after emancipation, while raising a child who wasn't his by blood, he saved enough to buy property. And she chose him, Sarah said. She chose to build a family with a man who saw her worth, and Samuel's worth. That photograph wasn't an accident. They were declaring themselves a family publicly, permanently. The team brought in Professor Angela Roberts, a sociologist studying mixed-race identity in 19th-century America, to help them understand what life might have looked like for Samuel. Children like Samuel lived in a painful liminal space, she explained. Too light to be fully accepted in some black communities. Barred, because of who raised him and where he lived, from white society. And his very existence was proof of a violence everyone knew about, and no one wanted to name. She pulled up historical records on her laptop. But we also have testimonies of children raised in circumstances like his, some who faced hostility even within their own families, and others who were embraced completely. Especially where the love of their parents was never in question. What happened to him? Michael asked. Did he stay with them? Hayes had already been chasing that thread. A Samuel appears in the 1870 census, living with Thomas and Catherine, age 4, Race recorded as mulatto, the classification used at the time for people of mixed ancestry. A school record from 1873 shows a Samuel enrolled in a bureau-sponsored school, sponsored by Thomas and Catherine. After 1875, the trail goes cold. Samuel's name vanishes from Charleston's records entirely. That's not unusual for this period, Hayes said. Reconstruction was collapsing. Violence against black communities was rising. Families scattered, looking for safety. He may have moved north or west. He may have changed his name. If he was light enough, he may have chosen to pass as white. It happened more than we know. Sarah added quietly. Sometimes families made the almost unbearable choice to send a light-skinned child away, a new name, a new life, somewhere they wouldn't face the same danger. One of the untold tragedies of this period, Professor Roberts said, families broken apart not by slavery this time, but by the impossible choices freedom forced on them. The room sat with that in silence. The photograph took on new weight. Perhaps it was the only image Thomas and Catherine had ever managed to keep of their son, proof, if nothing else, that he had existed, that he had been theirs. News of the discovery spread first through academic circles, then further. The museum's inbox filled with messages from people wanting to know more, some offering family stories that echoed Thomas and Catherine's. One stood out. It came from Joyce Turner, 76, of Philadelphia. My grandmother told me stories about her grandmother, a woman named Catherine, who lived in Charleston after slavery ended. She said Catherine raised a child who wasn't hers by birth, but was hers by choice. She said his name was Samuel, and that he traveled far to find peace. I never understood what that meant. When I read about the photograph, I knew I had to reach out. Sarah called her that same day. 2 weeks later, Joyce arrived at the museum carrying her own family photographs, including a faded tintype of an elderly black woman she identified as Catherine, likely taken sometime in the 1890s. My grandmother said Catherine lived until 1902, Joyce explained. She and Thomas stayed in Charleston the rest of their lives, helped start a church, raised 2 daughters, born in the 1870s. But she said Catherine always kept one photograph wrapped in cloth, somewhere private, that she'd look at sometimes but never show to anyone. Joyce reached into her bag and pulled out a small, worn piece of yellowed linen, embroidered delicately along the edges. My grandmother gave me this before she died. Said it was what Catherine used to wrap that photograph. She told me, "Your great-great-grandmother loved a child the world didn't understand, and she never once apologized for it." Michael examined the fabric under proper light. The dimensions matched. Joyce, eyes filled. I grew up knowing our family history was complicated, that some things weren't discussed outside the family. But my grandmother always said Catherine was the strongest woman she ever knew, that she chose love when the world expected her to choose bitterness. She looked up. Is that my family?" Sarah handed her a tablet showing the restored image. Joyce stared at it for a long time. Then she nodded, tears on her face. "That's her. I can see it, the eyes, the way she holds her shoulders. And that baby." Her voice broke. "That's the child she loved." Over the following weeks, Joyce shared oral history passed down through 4 generations. Samuel had left Charleston around 1876 during the violent collapse of Reconstruction. Thomas and Catherine made the agonizing decision to send him north with members of their church who were relocating to Philadelphia, believing he'd have a better chance there. If necessary, he could pass as white to stay safe. My grandmother said, Catherine cried for months after he left. Joyce said, she'd sit with that photograph and talk to it, like he could hear her. The family received one letter from Samuel in 1883, passed along through an intermediary. He was alive, working as a clerk, grateful for everything they'd given him. No mention of a wife or children. No letter ever came after that. Joyce looked at the photograph once more. She kept his memory alive, made sure we'd know his story, even when she couldn't say his name out loud. That's a love that survives everything. Dr. Mitchell organized a symposium to place the photograph within the broader history of Reconstruction. Historians, sociologists, and descendants of Reconstruction-era families gathered to discuss what it represented. Professor David Grant of Duke University presented research on mixed-race families in the post-emancipation South. We estimate tens of thousands of children were born into circumstances like Samuel's children, whose very existence testified to the sexual violence built into slavery. He showed census data revealing a sharp rise in children recorded as mulatto through the late 1860s and 1870s, many raised within black families. These weren't abstractions. These were real children who needed homes, love, protection, and despite everything trauma, poverty, a society offering them no support, families like Thomas and Catherine stepped forward anyway. Professor Roberts spoke on the psychological weight of it. We have to hold the complexity here. Catherine didn't choose Samuel's conception. She chose to be his mother. That distinction matters. She reclaimed agency in a situation built to deny her any. That's resilience, not resignation. The room turned emotional as descendants began sharing their own family histories. Several revealed they, too, had light-skinned ancestors born in the 1860s whose origins had always been whispered about, never openly discussed. One woman, Margaret Wilson of Atlanta, stood to speak, her voice unsteady. My great-great-grandfather was raised by a black family in South Carolina, but he was light enough to pass. In the 1880s he moved to Atlanta and lived the rest of his life as a white man. Married a white woman. Had children. None of them knew the truth until my grandmother found his letters after he died. We carried that secret for generations, ashamed of it. She paused. But seeing this photograph, understanding what Thomas and Catherine did, it changes how I see our story. They loved children like my great-great-grandfather when no one else would. Michael completed the full restoration, recovering detail invisible for 154 years. Catherine's face came through with startling clarity. She was younger than they'd first guessed, perhaps 25, her eyes holding both determination and grief. Thomas looked to be in his early 30s, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder, his expression serious but gentle. Samuel, 3 or 4 months old in the photograph, was unmistakably light-skinned and unmistakably held with tenderness, curled close against Catherine's heart. The full restoration revealed one more detail. Pinned to Catherine's dress, barely visible until now, was a small brass pin clasped hands, a symbol used by abolitionist societies and later by freed people's associations to represent solidarity and mutual protection. She wore that on purpose, Sarah said, studying it. For this photograph, she was saying, this is my family. This is my choice. And I stand with everyone who believes in protecting our own, including this child. Before the public unveiling, the museum invited Joyce Turner and other descendants for a private viewing. 23 people came, 5 generations, all descended from Catherine and Thomas through their 2 daughters. When the photograph was revealed at full size on the gallery wall, the room went silent. Then, Joyce stepped forward and placed her hand against the glass over Catherine's face. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for being brave enough to love him. Thank you for giving him a chance. The exhibition, Families Forged in Freedom, Reconstruction's Hidden Stories, opened in January 2021. The photograph of Thomas, Catherine, and Samuel stood as its centerpiece, framed by the documents, testimonies, and oral histories the team had gathered. The exhibit didn't soften the truth of how Samuel came to be. It named the violence plainly, while honoring the love and choice that shaped his upbringing. The wall text read, "This photograph documents a family built on resilience, choice, and love in the aftermath of unspeakable violence." It asks us to hold both truths, the brutality of this history and the extraordinary humanity of those who survived it. Visitors came by the thousands. Teachers brought students. Families stood in front of the photograph for long minutes, working through what it meant. A guest book filled with reflections. One read, "My own family never talked about the light-skinned relatives in our old photographs. Now I understand the silence, and why it was wrong. Another, Thomas was a father to a child who needed one. That's what love looks like. National coverage followed, sparking wider conversation about mixed-race heritage, sexual violence under slavery, and the families people chose to build in its aftermath. The museum was careful, in every interview, to frame it correctly. This was Samuel's story, Catherine's story, Thomas's story, not a curiosity, but a testimony. Catherine taught us that love is a choice you make every day, Joyce told one reporter, especially when circumstances make it hard. She chose Samuel. Thomas chose both of them. That's our legacy. A year after the unveiling, the museum held a commemoration. Descendants gathered again, joined by historians and others whose families carried similar histories. In Charleston, a small monument was dedicated at the site of Thomas and Catherine's home in Hampstead, now an empty lot. A bronze plaque bore the restored photograph and an inscription the family had written together. Here lived Thomas and Catherine, who chose love and family when the world offered them neither. Here they raised Samuel and built a life of dignity. May their courage remind us that family is defined not by blood alone, but by the love we choose to give and the children we choose to protect. Dr. Mitchell delivered the dedication. This photograph teaches us that our history isn't simple. It holds violence and love, trauma and resilience, pain and extraordinary grace at the same time. Thomas, Catherine, and Samuel's story isn't a comfortable one. It shouldn't be. But it's true, and it matters. She gestured toward the descendants gathered around her. These people exist because Catherine chose survival and love. Because Thomas chose to be a father when nothing required it of him. Because Samuel was raised by people who saw his worth in a world built to deny it. That's not a story of shame. That's a story of triumph over impossible odds. Joyce laid flowers at the base of the monument, her children and grandchildren beside her. Catherine kept that photograph wrapped in cloth for decades, she said, protecting it, protecting his memory. She wanted us to know this story someday. She trusted we'd be ready to understand it. Today, we prove she was right. As the ceremony closed, a local children's choir sang hymns that would have been familiar inside the church where Samuel was baptized. Their voices rising into the winter air, a small defiant note of continuity. The photograph remains on permanent display, a record of a family that built itself in defiance of a world designed to make that love impossible. It stands as proof that even in the wreckage slavery left behind, people found ways to choose each other and to protect the children who needed protecting. Thomas, Catherine, and Samuel's story isn't singular. Thousands of families walked a version of this same road, carried this same weight of pain and love. What this photograph offers them is visibility, documentation, recognition. It says, this happened. This family was real. This love was real. And somewhere in museum archives and in family albums across the country, other photographs like it are still waiting. Other complicated families, other chosen bonds. Each one a reminder that history isn't made of abstractions, it's made of individual people, individual choices, individual acts of love, echoing forward through every generation that came after.